Hello, I'm Jamie from Shamrock Girl World, and today I'm going to talk about how I grew my very first dragon fruit flowers in June 2022. In this video, I'll highlight the moments I discovered the flower buds until the flowers finally bloomed. But before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to my channel and ring the notification bell for more videos about exotic fruits and how to grow them from seeds. You can also follow my Instagram and Facebook pages for more fruit tree updates and the occasional Irish music and dance. I grow about 15 dragon fruit varieties in Austin, Texas and U.S. Hardiness Zone 8B. It's possible to grow them in this moderate zone, but I must protect them from cold weather and freezes. I feature one variety from seeds in many of my videos. Most of my current plants were from cuttings that I collected in spring 2021. I grow my large plants in 5-gallon self-watering containers with tomato cages. By late March 2022, I took the dragon fruits out of their winter greenhouse because they were getting heat stressed. I still had to protect them from random freezing nights. I put them in a safe spot so we could cover them during cold nights while warm weather returned. In mid-April, I trimmed the dragon fruit's winter growth. I also trained some of their branches to form their canopies. I gave the dragon fruits water-soluble bloom-boosting fertilizer that was high in phosphorus and potassium in the NPK ratio. I also moved the plants into more sun once the cold nights were over. I fertilized the plants every 2 weeks, and as a result, the dragon fruit plants started growing more branches as the warm spring weather was consistent. By late May, I visited my dragon fruits after we had a severe windstorm during the week. Many of my dragon fruit trellises fell over, and I wanted to check them for damage. Because some of them had sun damage, I moved them into a shady spot to recover for a few days. While inspecting the plants for damage, I noticed a small green growth on an Edgar's baby branch. It didn't look like a new branch growth, which appears more like a fist coming out of the node. When I looked closer, I could see the little leaflets on the tops. There was another large growth on the tip of a branch. I noticed 3 growths on Edgar's baby's branches. I checked my other dragon fruits for similar growth. I was shocked to see that my Zamorano plant had 3 growths on it. I knew Zamorano flowers would have red petal tips. That's when I knew I had flower buds on my dragon fruits. Both plants were from cuttings that I purchased the previous year in May 2021. I put them in their 5-gallon bucket trellises the following June. These were not any of my 4-year-old Ecuador Paloras dragon fruits from seeds. None of my other dragon fruit varieties had flower buds, mostly because they were still small and hadn't reached the top of their trellises. I was happy to have at least 2 varieties blooming at the same time because each one is self-sterile. They'll need each other's pollen to set fruit, so I hoped that they would bloom at the same time. I couldn't wait to see the buds grow and have my first dragon fruit flowers and potential fruit. 2 days later, I got a better look at the buds. The Zamorano buds got bigger. The Edgar's baby's buds were still growing and had sap on the tips, which was a good sign. I marked the discovery date next to the buds. I discovered a 4th bud forming on the 2nd plant in the trellis. Then I discovered a 5th bud, then a 6th, and a 7th and 8th. I slowly moved the Edgar's baby's trellis back into the sun. I also marked the branches with orange tape so I could keep track of the buds and branches. By the next day, the buds were growing before my eyes, especially the Zamoranos. More petals were forming and the buds got longer. The Edgar's babies were growing too with more petals, but one was not growing as much. It's crazy how 3 days of growth would look like. 6 days later, I checked the dragon fruits again. The Zamoranos got even bigger and had red markings throughout the flower. Each flower appeared healthy and no more buds formed on the plant. I was confident that the buds would turn into flowers. The Edgar's babies were also looking great. The buds even had some faint pink streaks on the petals. Many of the Edgar's babies were different sizes from each other. By this time, I noticed many aborted buds. Some had already fallen off, while some were turning yellow and didn't change their sizes. But it was clear which ones would remain, so I continued to feed and watch the dragon fruits grow. I went away to Houston on June 10th and 11th. Before I left, I received a photo of the dragon fruits on Thursday the 9th, and the dragon fruits noticeably got bigger. While I was in Houston and exploring plant nurseries there, I thought about my dragon fruits and received another photo of them. I was shocked about how big the Zamoranos got over the past 3 days. I was worried that they would open this week instead of next week. I was also worried that the Zamoranos would open before the Edgar's babies since I needed to cross-pollinate them. So later that night, I went to some Texas-based dragon fruit groups to ask for pollen in Houston, since there was likely more dragon fruit growers in the warmer zone and humid city. Luckily, I found someone with dragon fruit pollen from a noid, or no identification flower, that opened the night before. I was so happy to receive a vial of dragon fruit pollen from a fellow dragon fruit grower. I kept the refrigerated pollen in a cup of ice and returned to Austin. Once I got home, I gathered my dragon fruit pollination kit. I had 3 stainless steel bowls, large and small makeup brushes, 1.5 milliliter test tube vials, silica packs, plastic bags, and aluminum foil. I also plan on getting a mini car or keyboard vacuum to suck up the pollen. Many dragon fruit growers were using them to collect as much pollen as they could from the flowers, but the vacuum wouldn't come in time. I made it back to Austin just in time because the Zamoranos were ready to bloom the next day. Their white petals were exposed and the tips of the flowers were soft. I captured a time lapse of the Zamorano flowers. After 9 p.m., an hour after sunset, all 3 flowers opened, displaying their unique colors. After 10:30, I pollinated the flowers using the noid pollen. Using a thin eyeliner brush, I brushed the pollen into the long stigmas whole. I also pushed the pollen further inside the hole using an aerial root. I was careful to make sure the pollen wouldn't blow out during the windy night. I was shocked about how large and stunning the flowers were. They were about 8 inches wide, about the length of a standard water bottle. I kept noticing a light scent of a salty beach and suntan lotion, so I believe the flowers had a subtle scent. 30 minutes later, I collected the pollen from the 3 flowers using a large makeup brush. I was careful to brush the pollen into the bowl and away from the stigma. The foil helped keep the wind off the pollen. I got a bunch of pollen from the flowers and I left it at room temperature to dry overnight. I hand-pollinated the flowers a 3rd time just in case. I wanted to make sure the beautiful flowers would set fruit. I just loved the flowers, and I was happy to watch them open over the evening. I recorded the flowers opening a bit and closing from midnight to 11:30 the next morning. The flowers withered in the 100-degree day. I also collected the dry pollen and put them in 3.5 test tube vials and put them in the fridge. After the Zamoranos closed by the afternoon, I noticed one of the Edgar's baby's flowers transforming over the hours. By noon, the flower didn't look as if it would bloom, but hours later, the white petals appeared on the tip. It was ready to bloom, so I got my materials ready again to see my second variety open. I recorded the flower opening from 6 p.m. to about 10:45. By 9 p.m., the flower opened during the windy night. It was smaller than the Zamorano, but nevertheless stunning. The beach-like scent returned, and even my family noticed. I pollinated the flower using the rest of the noid pollen that I used the previous day. I brushed and pushed the pollen into the stigma. Later, I collected the pollen from the flower. It didn't have as much pollen as a single Zamorano, but I gathered as much as I could to put in the vials. There was just enough to fill 1 vial. I filmed the flower opening a little more and closing by the next morning. I'm glad I pollinated the flowers before the insects did. The flower closed nicely by the next afternoon. I checked the other flowers and determined that they would not open in the evening because they were still firm. The bottom one was smaller than the other 2, but the larger one could open in a day or so. I looked at the Zamoranos and they were still drying in the hot sun. It would take a few more days to know if the pollination was successful. The next day, 2 more Edgar's babies bloomed on the opposite sides of the trellis. 2 flowers from separate plants bloomed at the same time. This time, I used Zamorano pollen instead of the noid. I carefully pollinated the 2 flowers and continued to get pictures and photos of them. I collected pollen from the flowers too, getting more than the day before. The dragon fruits opened and closed similarly through the night and into the next morning. As the 2 flowers closed into the next day, the last flower showed signs that it too would bloom. I was bummed that my car vacuum didn't arrive in time, but I was ready to watch the last small flower open. The flower opened steadily through the evening into sunset. Once the flower was open, I gathered a little bit of Zamorano pollen into a vial. I carefully pollinated the flower using the eyelash brush, pushing and twisting the pollen into the stigma. It helped that the brush had black bristles so you can see the pollen. Then I got a toothpick and pushed the pollen into the stigma. I really wanted the pollen to set fruit. Then I collected pollen from the flower. I carefully pushed the stigma under the bowl and brushed the pollen into the bowl. I had to make sure not to touch the top of the stigma. I also saw how using a vacuum would be easier because you can get pollen that fell into the back of the flower. I didn't record a time-lapse of the flower closing, but it was bittersweet to see my last flower close. The next step with the dragon fruits is to see if all of the flowers set fruit. I cross-pollinated all of them with compatible pollen, so everything should work out. After about a week, I'll remove the flowers from the buds so there's less risk of mold and rot. So for now, I'll have to watch the flowers carefully and hope that I can have my very first dragon fruits. I'll release another update video from post-pollination to fruit harvest. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to learn more about how to grow dragon fruits, check out my Growing Dragon Fruits playlist. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel and ring the notification bell, and follow my Instagram and Facebook pages for more videos about exotic fruits, growing exotic fruits, gardening, outdoor crafts, and more. Thank you.